There is this moment, and I think you know the one I mean, where you are walking through your house in the dark. Maybe it is 2 a.m., and you've gotten up for a glass of water, and you are moving through a hallway you've walked through 1,000 times, and then you see it. Something in the corner, something that shouldn't be there, a shape. And for just a fraction of a second, maybe less than that, your whole body responds. Your chest tightens. Your step slows. Your breath does something strange, and then the light reaches it properly, or your eyes adjust, or you get close enough, and you realize it is a coat. It is just the coat you hung on the back of a chair that morning and forgot about, and you exhale, and maybe you even laugh a little at yourself, at the absurdity of it. You knew this hallway. You knew there was nothing there, and yet something in you, some part of you that moved faster than thought, had already decided it was something else. I want to sit with that moment for a little while, because I think it is telling us something we usually just file away. We laugh, we move on, we pour the glass of water. But what actually happened there? What was that fraction of a second? What was the thing that knew before you knew? Because here is what I keep coming back to. You didn't see the coat and then get scared. You were scared, or something like scared, before the coat was even a coat, before your conscious mind had assembled any conclusion at all. The response was already there. The meaning was already there. Something had already done the work. And if that is true, if the meaning was already assigned before you were even aware of it, then what does that say about the version of the world you think you are seeing? I don't want to answer that too quickly. I want us to just hold it for a moment, because I think if we move past it too fast, we miss the strange and slightly vertiginous thing that is happening underneath it. We tend to think of perception as a kind of arrival. Something happens out there in the world, and then it travels into us, and then we notice it. We think of our senses as windows, neutral, faithful, accurate. The light comes in. The sound reaches us. We perceive it seems so passive, so obvious. Of course, the thing you see is the thing that is there. Of course, what you hear is what was said. Of course, your first impression of a person reflects something real about them. We stake a tremendous amount on this. We build our trust in our own minds on this foundation, that what we experience is, more or less, what is. And yet that moment in the hallway keeps pulling at something. Because in that moment, you didn't experience what was there. You experienced what your brain had decided was probably there. And the deciding happened so fast and so far below the level of your awareness that it felt like perception. It felt like seeing. But it was something else, something more like guessing. And I think we do this constantly, not just in dark hallways, in every single moment of every single day. The brain is not waiting for information to arrive and then interpreting it. It is running ahead, making predictions, and then checking to see if it got it right. What you experience, what feels like reality, is mostly the prediction. The world outside is just there to correct the mistakes. Let me try to make that feel real, because right now it probably sounds like a strange philosophical claim, something that is interesting to think about, but doesn't really change anything. So let me take you somewhere else. Think about a time when you misheard something, not just a small misunderstanding, really misheard it. Someone said something perfectly ordinary, and what you heard was something completely different, maybe something funnier or stranger or more alarming. And when you realized your mistake, you tried to unhear the wrong version and hear the right one. But for a second, just a second, you couldn't quite do it. The wrong version had this strange persistence, like it had been stamped there. That is not just a funny story about imperfect hearing. That is your brain showing you its workings for a moment, pulling back the curtain. Because what happened wasn't that you heard the sound and then misinterpreted it. What happened is that your brain, using context and expectation, and the shape of the conversation, and 1,000 other signals that you weren't consciously tracking, had already decided what the person was about to say. And when the actual sounds arrived, your brain fit them into the meaning that had already been prepared. It didn't fail to perceive correctly. It succeeded at predicting, just predicted the wrong thing. And the prediction was so convincing, so fully formed, that it felt like hearing. Think about what that means. The sound is just vibration in the air. Your eardrum moves, tiny bones move, signals travel. And somewhere in there, the sound stops being a sound and becomes a meaning, becomes words, becomes intent, becomes something you can respond to. And all of that happens, has to happen, before you are consciously aware of any of it. By the time you think, they said X, the brain has already done the entire translation. You arrive at the end of a process you were never part of. There is something almost strange about that, isn't there? The sense of hearing something, the felt experience of it, the sense of sounds becoming words becoming meaning. That whole thing is something your consciousness receives, not something your consciousness produces. You are not the one doing the perceiving. You are the one the perceiving is reported to. And I think this matters more than it might seem at first. Because we don't just experience the world through our senses. We make decisions based on what we perceive. We form opinions. We trust people or distrust them. We feel safe or we feel afraid. We fall in love. We hold grudges. We build entire frameworks for understanding who we are and what the world is like. And all of it rests on this foundation of perception that we've never really looked at closely. We assumed it was just showing us what is there. And maybe it mostly is. But the coat in the hallway keeps bothering me. Because even if the system gets it right 99 times, there is something important about the one time it doesn't. Not because errors are frequent, they aren't. But because when the system makes a mistake, it reveals something about how the system works. And the coat in the hallway, the misheard word, the face you read wrong, these aren't glitches. These are the normal process becoming briefly visible. The prediction showing through the seams. Let me tell you about something else. About meeting someone for the first time. You know that thing that happens, that almost instantaneous thing where you form some sense of a person, before they've said much, before you know anything about them. Really, there is already something. A warmth or a wariness, an openness or a kind of low-level unease you couldn't quite explain, and we tend to treat that as intuition, as some deeper form of reading the room. And sometimes it is, sometimes experience and pattern recognition are working in your favor, and that instinct is genuinely useful. But think about how many times it was wrong. Think about the people you mistrusted at first, and then came to love. The people who seemed immediately safe and turned out not to be. Think about the first impression that hardened into a judgment, and stayed there even after evidence accumulated that it shouldn't. Think about how hard it is to revise a first impression, not because you are a bad or biased person, but because the first impression was never really an impression at all. It was a prediction, and the brain, having made a prediction and sent it up to consciousness as a perception, is now in the business of protecting that prediction, looking for evidence that confirms it, subtly discounting evidence that doesn't. And this is where it starts to feel a little uncomfortable, because it is not just that we misperceive things sometimes. It is that the misperception can shape everything that comes after. The brain makes a call, sends it up as a reality, and then, from inside that constructed reality, we live our lives. I keep thinking about the gap between what is actually out there, light bouncing off surfaces, sound waves moving through air, physical bodies doing physical things, and what we experience. Because those two things are not the same. They cannot be the same. The light has to become electrical signals. The signals have to become patterns. The patterns have to become meanings. And somewhere in that chain of translation, something is added that wasn't in the original context. History, expectation, emotion, all of it gets folded in before the experience reaches you. You don't perceive reality. You perceive your brain's best current model of reality. And the model is very good. Most of the time, the model is excellent, but it is still a model. Still one version of an interpretation, not the thing itself. And here is the part that I find genuinely strange, the part that I can't quite think my way out of. Your brain is inside the reality it is trying to model. It is not separate from the thing it is interpreting. It is made of the same stuff. It exists within the same physical world it is trying to construct a picture of, which means there is this recursive quality to the whole thing. The brain is part of the system, and the brain is building a model of the system, and the model is what you live inside of. You can't step outside it to check. You can't compare the model to the thing itself, because the only tool you have for comparing anything is the model. And we walk around trusting this completely. Not because we verified it, not because we've tested it, but because it works, mostly, because the coffee cup doesn't float through your hand, because you can find your keys, because when you reach for something, you usually reach in the right direction. The model is good enough that it feels like reality. And that feeling of reality, that immediate, unquestioned sense that what you are perceiving is what is, that might be the deepest layer of all. Not just a thought, not just a perception, but something more foundational than both. A whole architecture of assumed certainty that runs quietly in the background. But think again about the coat. Think about the moment before you recognized it. There was a creature in your house. That was real, not as an external fact, but as an experience. You had the experience of a creature being in your house. That experience was happening. Something that was not a creature was generating the experience of a creature. And for a split second, you lived in a world that was different from the one you were standing in. Now I want to ask something, and I want to ask it slowly, because I think it is easy to slide past it. How do you know that doesn't still happen? Not in such an obvious way, not a coat that becomes a creature, but in subtler ways, in smaller ways, in ways that never get corrected, because the feedback never comes clearly enough. How do you know? How can you know that the version of reality you are currently running isn't also a prediction that just hasn't been disconfirmed yet? I am not trying to suggest that nothing is real or that the world is an illusion. I don't think that is where this goes. But I think there is something important in the question itself, something that is worth sitting with, even if it makes you slightly uncomfortable. There is a particular experience that I think almost everyone has had, and I am not sure we talk about it enough. It is the experience of retrospective misunderstanding, where you discover, sometimes weeks, months, years later, that you had fundamentally misread a situation. A relationship you thought was one thing was actually something else. A dynamic you felt certain about had a dimension you'd completely missed. And when you finally see it, there is this disorienting quality to the revision. Because it is not just that you understand it differently now. It is that you have to go back and re-remember things differently. The memories themselves shift slightly. The meaning of old events changes. And you realize that for all that time, you were living in a coherent and fully felt and utterly convincing version of events. That was, in some important way, a construction, not a lie, not a delusion, just a construction. A model the brain had built and lived in and trusted and never had reason to revise until it did. And when I think about that, really think about it, I start to wonder about the models I am currently living in. The things that feel so obviously true, so immediately given, that I've never thought to question them. Not because they're wrong, necessarily, but because I know, from the coat and the misheard word and the revised memory, that the system can be utterly certain and still be constructing rather than simply perceiving. There is something almost paradoxical about the efficiency of it all. The fact that it usually works so well is exactly what makes it so invisible. If our perception was unreliable in obvious ways all the time, we would have developed a robust habit of questioning it. We would know, in our bones, that what we see is not necessarily what is there. But because it is almost always reliable, we extend that reliability into a kind of absolute trust. We stop questioning it. And the questioning is precisely what might keep us honest. Think about how this shows up in something as ordinary as attention. You are in a conversation and you are distracted, really distracted, somewhere else in your head, and someone asks you a question, and you catch the last few words, and your brain fills in the rest. Constructs a plausible version of the question based on context and pattern, and what you'd expect someone to ask in this kind of conversation, and you answer. And sometimes you answer correctly, because the prediction was right, and the other person is satisfied, and you move on, and neither of you ever knows that you answered a question you didn't actually hear. You answered the predicted question, the constructed question, the version your brain assembled from fragments and educated guessing. How often does that happen? In small ways, in quiet moments, in half-attended conversations. How often are we responding not to what is there, but to what we expected to be there? And how often does it not matter? Because the prediction is close enough. And how often does it matter enormously, and we never find out? The gap between what is actually being said and what we hear is not filled with nothing. It is filled with everything we've brought to the moment. Our history, our assumptions, our emotional state, the weight of previous conversations, the particular sensitivity of that day. None of that is out there in the world. All of that is in us. And we pour it into the gap, and what comes out the other side is called experience, is called reality, is called what happened. I find myself thinking about children sometimes, when I think about this, about how they learn to perceive, because perception is, in some way, learned. A very young child doesn't yet have the rich library of predictions that an adult carries. They haven't built up the associations, the expectations, the patterns, and there is something extraordinary about watching a child encounter something genuinely new, something outside their existing model. They look at it differently than we do. For longer, with a kind of raw attention that adults can barely access anymore. Because for a child, the world is constantly correcting the model, feeding in new data, updating the predictions. And for an adult, So much of what we encounter falls into a category we already have, gets filed without real examination, fits the template so well that we barely have to look. When was the last time you really looked at something, not glanced at it and categorized it and moved on? Really looked, with the kind of attention that doesn't already know what it is looking at. I am not sure I do it very often. I am not sure most of us do. And I wonder how much the world we think we're seeing is actually the world, and how much is the very convincing interior of a library we built a long time ago. Here is something I keep returning to, something that I find difficult to fully hold in my mind without it slipping away. The moment you become aware of something, the moment it enters your conscious experience, it is already in the past. The processing has already happened. The meaning has already been assigned. Somewhere in the brain, a decision has been made about what this is, what it means, whether it matters, and how to feel about it. And then, as if there is some slight delay between the event and the theater where it plays, the awareness arrives. The experience happens, and it feels immediate. It feels like now, but it isn't quite now. It never was. That is not a figure of speech. It is close to something literally true, in a way that most people never have occasion to think about. The sensation of a thing and the conscious experience of that thing are not the same moment. There is a tiny interval between them, too small to notice, but real. Your brain is doing a staggering amount of work in a space of time, so brief you can't perceive it. And by the time you perceive anything, the decision about what you are perceiving has already been made somewhere below you, in the dark machinery, by something that feels like you but isn't quite the you that is sitting here, watching the experience arrive. What is that thing? What is the part that processes before you know? I don't think there is an easy answer. I don't think there is a clean line between the self that predicts and the self that experiences. But the code in the hallway suggests they're not the same. The misheard word suggests they're not the same. Every moment of delayed realization, every time you understand something 3 seconds after it happens, every time you react to something before you've consciously processed it, all of those are evidence that something is doing the work before the aware part of you arrives. And the part that has always unsettled me just slightly is this. The aware part is the one writing the autobiography. The aware part is the one who says, I saw, I heard, I felt, I decided. It takes credit for the whole process. It experiences itself as the origin of the perception rather than the recipient of it, which might mean that the story we tell about ourselves, the narrative of being an aware, conscious, perceiving being moving through a world we directly experience, is itself partly a construction. Another layer of model, built on top of model, predictions about the self, built on top of predictions about the world. All of it so deeply nested that the bottom layer is essentially invisible. I don't know what to do with that entirely. I am not sure it is the kind of thing you do anything with. But I think there is something valuable in just not looking away from it, in letting it sit there and be strange. Because the alternative is to go back to the automatic trust, to treat every perception as direct contact with reality, every reaction as a clear and accurate response to what is there. And I think we lose something when we do that. Some quality of attention, some willingness to say, wait, is that actually what I am seeing, or is that what I expected to see? The coat in the dark hallway, the misheard sentence, the face you read too quickly, the memory that quietly revised itself, the question you answered before you heard it, the moment in a conversation when you felt absolutely certain about something you had actually constructed. These are not embarrassments. These are not failures of the mind. They are the mind showing itself to you briefly in the gap between the prediction and the correction. And in that gap, if you are paying the right kind of attention, there is something almost astonishing, because what you see there is the machinery of your entire experience of being alive, running ahead of you, deciding things for you, presenting you with a world, and you trust it. What else would you do? But I wonder, and I wonder this in a way that doesn't really resolve, whether trusting it and understanding it are two different things. Whether you can do both at once. Whether knowing that the coat was already a creature before you chose to believe in the creature changes anything. Whether knowing that the word was already wrong before you chose to hear it wrong shifts something. Whether knowing that the person was already judged before you consciously judged them opens any kind of space. I think it might. I think that space, small as it is, uncomfortable as it is, might be one of the most honest places there is. Not the place of certainty, where perception delivers reality cleanly and the mind responds faithfully, but the place between the prediction and the awareness, the gap where the decision has already been made and the experience hasn't arrived yet. You've been there. You go there, constantly. You just don't usually know it. By the time you notice anything, it is already too late. The question is only whether that changes anything, whether knowing it opens something, or whether the next dark hallway will still have its creature, and your breath will still catch. And by the time you reach the light, the deciding will already be done. I don't know the answer to that. I am not sure the answer is the point.